Firewatch is complicated. The 8-year-old indie game has been getting a lot of praise online for the past few weeks, and for good reason. The game was, and still is, incredible, and one of the gems of the mid-2010s in gaming. Now we have a new generation of gamers finding out about Firewatch and the story that goes along with it. And with most of the videos covering the game coming out around the time of the game's release, or within that same time frame, I thought it would be a good idea to make a recoverage of Firewatch for everyone just finding out about this gorgeous game. Most people that have any surface level knowledge of the game only recognize it from the immeasurable amounts of wallpapers made from the game, and discussions online about a subpar ending. I want to break down everything about Firewatch and give more context as to what the true intent of the game was and why people have such a disliking for the ending. We open the game to a short, semi-choose-your-own-adventure type of story. We're introduced to the time and place that this story is taken in, 1975, Boulder, Colorado. And then we are met with the first real line of the game. You see Julia. We are immediately brought into the shoes of our main character, Henry. We click it and learn a little bit more about this Julia. She's in her late 20s, which is about the same age as Henry. An option to approach Julia is presented, and we, once again, click it. We strike up a conversation with her, and 1 week later, we're dating. Then, bam, we are put into the game. But not in the way that any promotional material would have led you to believe. We are in an elevator, which is like very unnatural. I think that the developers forgot what type of game this is, but we press on anyways. Picking up the backpack on the floor next to us and the elevator door swinging open, we find our car in a parking garage. Checking our backpack into the trunk, we hop in and we are brought back to our story with Julia. We date for over a year, move in together, and as the game states, life is good. And as life progresses, we get to make even more decisions, like what type of dog we get. Of course, you choose the Beagle because the game literally states how much Julia loves it. And Bucket? Come on! That's the one right there. She also asks us about kids, and then brings up how we should get married. As Julia says, these kids are gonna be screwed up enough. It's probably for the best that their parents are hitched. Suddenly, we're brought back to the real world, and for the first time, we're actually in the wilderness. Looking around nature in this game for the first time really transports you into the world, with just how stunning the visuals are. We take a quick look at the map to find our lookout's location, Two Forks Lookout in Shoshone National Forest, which is an actual forest in the state of Wyoming. We get to hiking and are transported back to the story, 5 years after we first met Julia and started dating. Our relationship gets a little bit weakened by some fighting after Julia comes home late and doesn't answer any messages we sent her, though it seems fine as we are now in a new year and still with Julia. We learn that Julia likes to draw and that she likes drawing us. We pose and, thank you, game. Back into the gameplay, we are still hiking on our way to the lookout, and oh my god, the visuals throughout this entire game are incredible. But I just can't believe how beautiful this is, man. It makes sense why this game has some banger wallpapers made after it, because just look at this. Getting brought back to the story after that insane shot, we get told that 9 years after we first met Julia, plans for kids have been pushed back. Life gets busy, and that seems to be what's happened between Henry and Julia here. Now, we are met with one of the toughest decisions in this entire part of the game's story. Julia gets a job offer in Yale, which is more than halfway across the country from where we live now. Julia wants to move and take the job, but we, by all stretches of the imagination, do not. So we can either convince her to not take the job, or agree if she commutes back and forth. No matter what choice we pick, we are brought to this part of the game's story where Julia has, quote-unquote, an episode. We find out after bringing her to the doctors that Julia has a developing case of dementia. She's only 41 years old. We decide to keep it a secret from everyone else for now. We are brought back to where we seem to be camping out for the night, while still on our hike to the lookout. We look at our journal and see the drawing that Julia made for us, those however many years ago. We close the journal and once again are brought away from the game into the story. Julia's developing case of dementia worsens as she's sent home from her job on permanent medical leave. She's obviously devastated. Her case has been getting worse and worse, and her nurse suggests getting Julia into a 24-hour care home. We sit on it for a while before making our decision. We don't argue and we say that we'll visit soon. Weeks go by and we see an ad for a summer job in the newspaper. We take it. We finally make it to our tower and once again, wow. Turning on the power, we almost instantly get a radio call from who we soon learn is Delilah. This is our first time hearing any type of conversation in the game outside of reading dialogue, and wow does this game also know how to do voice acting extremely well. It seriously has some of the best voice acting out of any game I've ever gotten the chance to play, and not many people argue that point. We have our first talk with who will now be our best and only friend out here in the woods. And that is our introduction to Firewatch.
Good night.
Welcome to the job.
On our first real day of the job, we get introduced to, well, the job. We wake up bright and early at 6:45 p.m. and Delilah tells us what is all around our lookout room and how to use the equipment and all that. But in the midst of her explanations, she's cut off by a sighting of...
Just it? Fine. What the fuck?
What is it?
Nothing. You use this to... Oh, fuck me!
Good God, language, lady.
Out your west-facing window. Are you seeing what I'm seeing? Are those fucking fireworks?
Whoa, that's not legal, right?
No.
Delilah sends us down to investigate the fireworks and make sure whoever's sending them off never thinks of doing so again. This is our first real time getting to adventure semi-freely throughout the forest, and man, I actually can't state enough how satisfyingly beautiful this game is when you just step back and look at it. There's something about this style of the game that just works. Making it to the site of where we saw fireworks earlier, we find a camp with a bunch of empty beer cans and backpacks. Definitely a group of teens who came out to the wilderness to have a good time. Sorting out the teens and making sure they don't light any campfires or fireworks out in the woods again.
You asshole!
We head back to our lookout tower, but not before being forced to explore a little bit more around the forest and getting comfortable with our surroundings. Making it through the canyon near the lake, we find a cave, which Delilah makes sure to spook us with by telling super scary stories about people who have gone missing in the cave. We laugh it off and make it quickly through with our newfound flashlight. But before fully exiting the cave, we do pass by a gated off area in the cave that's only accessible by key. I wonder if that'll come into play at some point in the story. Getting past the cave and almost up to our tower, we stumble across another woodsman, who Delilah shrugs off as just another explorer, since we are in the wilderness and people do tend to go camping in said wilderness. Finally entering our lookout tower for the night, we... Wait, what? One of our windows is broken, and our sheets are stolen? And it turns out the broken window is from someone who threw our typewriter out the window? Delilah says that she'll call her friend who works the main desk for the lookouts in the forest, and who tries to get a name for everyone who enters the forest in the morning. But for now, we just sit and wait. And that's the first day. Wild start to a summer up in these woods, but it really gives you a good grasp of how the story will mostly roll out and how to deal with problems. The game is quite open world-like, but with natural barriers and having a directed location to go at all times for the story and game to progress keeps the linear aspects in play too, which leads to the whole game having a good balance of freedom and a more linear experience. On our second day, we wake up to another radio call from Delilah saying that it seems the radio tower power lines have been cut or torn or something similar, either by accident or purposefully by some visitor who thought it was funny or something. We're sent up to the communication lines to see what happened, and we do indeed find a purposely chopped wire and a surrounding area that's covered in more beer cans like we saw earlier. Probably from those teens who we snuck up on, because there's another sign right next to the cut wire that says, well, yeah. Trying to find these teens in their newly set up camp, we have a chance of stumbling across a huge chain link fence in the area of the forest. We bring it up to Delilah, and she says that she has no idea what it's there for or what's going on inside the fence. We mostly ignore it and continue onwards. On our tracks, we find a quite old and forgotten backpack hanging on a branch of a dead tree. The name sewn on the backpack is a one Brian Goodwin, which we report to Delilah. Delilah is actually super surprised by hearing the name and gives us a little insight about the Goodwins. Apparently Ned, the father, and Brian Goodwin were stationed at Two Forks, which is where we are now. And even though it wasn't allowed to take your child with you, Delilah had let them come into the forest together since she knew that they weren't planning on getting up to anything dangerous like starting a fire or what have you. The father and son supposedly left the forest in the middle of their summer a year or so back. Inside the backpack is a disposable camera. This camera is used throughout the game, and the photos that you take with it are used for a different purpose. Almost immediately after finding the backpack and camera, we see a pretty decent cloud of smoke that would definitely point to another campfire. On our way to the originator of the new smoke cloud, Delilah questions us about relationships and if we've had any. Now, I'm gonna be honest, not many decisions that we make when it comes to our conversations with Delilah have much impact on the rest of the game. The only noticeable difference, other than this question here, is that you can either act friendly to Delilah or act professionally like you're on the job. If you act more professionally around her, she'll act more professionally too and make much less small talk and keep to herself for a lot of the game. But if you answer her in a more friendly manner, she's a lot more talkative throughout the game and is just more friendly back to us. Now, when we answer this question about relationships, we can either tell her about Julia, lie and say that we aren't in any type of relationship, or we can completely avoid the question. If we tell Delilah about Julia, we get slightly questioned about her throughout the rest of the game, where we can either answer her questions and tell her more about Julia's early diagnosis with dementia. We can slightly mention her but avoid her questioning mostly, which will lead to Delilah being less questioning as she picks up on us not really wanting to talk about her. If we tell Delilah that we have no one, she will drop the topic almost completely for the rest of the game. And if we completely avoid the question, Delilah will continue to try and pry for an answer. But if we stick to not telling her, Delilah will just never learn about Julia. And this is another showing of how much I love the dialogue in this game. It just conforms so easily to how you would expect real people working this type of job would act depending on how we, the player, choose to interact over the radio. The realism in the conversations adds so much to the overall immersion in this game. I can't compliment the voice actors and the scripters enough for making such an incredibly important piece of the game so perfect. Anyways, tracing our way back to the smoke, we find exactly what we thought we would. A campsite with a slightly put out fire. We stomp the fireplace out completely and look around the small site only to see clothes everywhere and the tent that the teens were supposedly using that has been shredded on the sides. We take a photo of the torn down campsite that was most likely just attacked by some bear coming across it. But not before we see a note still hanging on a part of the tent that is still up. It's a note to us that definitely confirms that it was the teens we spotted and tried to scare away earlier. But where are they gone, and why was their campsite all destroyed? It's not like they had just left because all of their stuff was still here. Having no way to report any of the site's damages since the phone lines had just been cut, we ignore it and move on. On our third day, Henry fixes our broken window from when it was broken into the night before, and we get to talk to Delilah some more as she questions us about our appearance. This talk is more important to getting Henry and Delilah more connected on a personal level, as Delilah actually draws a picture of us that she'll use as some sort of reference for what to picture when talking to us. Now skipping all the way to day 9, Henry's back in the canyon, presumably getting more warmed up to his surroundings in the lookout, eating his lunch. We get a call from Delilah telling us that those girls we found at the lake who had set off the fireworks and cut the radio tower's power line had actually been reported missing for about a week now, which lines up with the last time we found their campsite. Day 15. We wake up in the middle of the night to, surprisingly, a call from Julia. Henry is dreaming. And I'm gonna be honest, I truly thought that we were talking to Delilah in the scene for the first half of it. And I got fully jump scared by Henry using relationship nicknames, like, whoa man, what did I just miss? But that wasn't the case, and Julia goes on to say that Delilah seems nice, which in my and many other people's interpretation of this section, that Henry feels bad for feeling any type of affection for Delilah, and almost feels as if he's betraying Julia by acting this way with her. He feels guilty as if he's cheating on her by having these feelings with Delilah at all, which he might be to a lot of people, and we don't know exactly what's going on in Henry's head, but judging off of further dialogue we get in the game, I would say that Henry has a path where he ends up falling for Delilah. Jumping all the way to day 33 now, Henry's out of supplies for his tower, so Delilah says that he should hike out to where the company that deploys these fire lookout workers drop off their supplies for the months. While hiking out to grab the supplies, Delilah will ask us about how a few weeks back we were talking in our sleep into the radio. Our choices for how we interact with this discussion change depending on whether or not we have informed Delilah about our relationship with Julia yet or not, which is just another fun little detail. On day 64, well, more like night 64, Henry and Delilah are watching the distant fire burn, as their only real job is to report the fire to the authorities, which they've already done. Depending on past interactions, Delilah can get very flirty in this scene as she is quite drunk. If we interact with Delilah basically at all during this day, she'll go on about what her and Henry could do if they were together, not just talking over the radio. If we don't talk to her while she's this drunk, she won't talk about it at all. This day basically defines where the future of Henry and Delilah's relationship goes throughout the rest of the playthrough. Now, here on day 76, this is where the real narrative of the game starts to take over. Henry has decided to go fishing, but once he gets down to the lake, he finds a clipboard just sitting there on a stump. We pick it up only to find that it has past conversations on it between us and Delilah. Someone's been listening to them through the radio for who knows how long. We hear something rattle in the bushes behind us, and I'm gonna be honest again, I got genuinely scared from this scene for a bit. But I gathered my nerves and continued to investigate the strange noise that came from towards the canyon, and see a red radio thingy on the ground. We pick it up, and it looks quite similar to our radio.
Well, get it if you haven't already, and then we'll figure out...
We wake up to Delilah's worried cries over the radio, and we inform her of what just happened to us. We find on the clipboard a name of a lookout that goes by the name of Wapiti Station. And to no one's surprise, this station is in Wapiti Meadow, which, if you've forgotten, is exactly where the huge chain link fence we found earlier was located. The only way into the station is through a locked up gate. so Delilah suggests finding some sort of axe that many firefighters might have in their last seen location where they started to put out the fire from a few weeks ago. On our way over there, we discuss with Delilah the implications of what it might mean if someone was actually listening to our conversations over the radio this whole time, and why might anyone be doing this? We find the Pulaski, aka the axe, and start heading back over across the entire lookout to Wapiti Station. But as we head back over,
On my way back, in and out of trees in the middle of nowhere?
Do you see anybody?
No, definitely not.
All right, so tell me what you think of this. Did you just cough?
No. Did you just cough?
No.
someone coughs over the radio. Both Henry and Delilah are quite shocked by this, and the day abruptly ends as we now know almost for certain that someone else is on the line with us. On day 77 now, Delilah seems to be acting quite off, way too chipper for what has been happening. We soon realize that she's trying to tell us to find a new walkie-talkie that she hid out near the river without informing whoever might be listening to us that that's what we have planned. With our newfound safety and these new radios, we start heading to Wapiti Station. Now, if you haven't realized yet, there's a pretty noticeable difference in the air quality. This is from that fire that we pointed out just a few weeks ago that is still spreading. Luckily, the fire was naturally caused, but the damage is still being done, and as the game progresses, we will see the air quality of the surrounding area continue to get worse and worse. Making it to the once locked gate, we carefully and quietly open the gate and make our way inside. We head down through the bridge and down to the main section of the station. No one is here, but I still have a super eerie feeling the entire time I was down in this section. Like I had a high chance of getting jumped like earlier in the game again, and who knows what might happen then. We find all of the super advanced looking technology in a tent where it seems like a bunch of people were camping out. We find a wave receiver along with a bunch of stuff in the tent. The wave receiver almost instantly picks up a signal. The receiver follows down more through the tent to a desk with a bunch of clutter on it and a pinboard with a map that we soon realize has been tracking our movement this entire time. In front and center, we find a small box, which is what the wave receiver was picking up on. Underneath the box is a binder with Henry and Delilah's name on it, with the title of the binder being Subjects. Already having a ton of questions, we open the binder and find some unspeakable documents about Henry and Delilah. There's information about the both of them that neither of them have even told each other. Stuff like how long they've been working, past relationships, and other information that whoever does work here in Wapiti Station should have no idea about. Henry alerts Delilah, who is obviously in shock just as much as we are. Delilah lets her anger get the best of her and suggests burning down the forest, just to get back at whoever is doing this. We try to warn Delilah away from this idea, telling her that there's a pretty decent chance that if we burn down the forest, we'll get trapped in and probably suffocate ourselves. Without setting anything on fire ourselves, we try to leave the station only for the bridge after we get out to break beneath us, no longer giving us the opportunity to head back. Turning around, we do spot a fire from the station we are just at. Delilah instantly gets mad at us because she thinks that we started the fire even though we know we didn't. We try to convince her of this, but there's no real explanation for why the place suddenly caught on fire as soon as we left it. Now, on day 78, we can spot that Henry has actually removed his wedding ring. This is just giving the player proof that Henry is now fully invested in whatever mystery is going on in the forest, and he no longer is thinking about Julia or trying to quote-unquote distance himself from the thought of her. She is fully off of his mind, and he is now completely dedicated to figuring out what is happening in the forest and why he and Delilah have been getting tracked for who knows how long. Almost instantly on the new day, the wave receiver that we had picked up from the station suddenly is tracking a new signal. We try to inform Delilah about this, but while walking over to the new signal's location, Delilah informs us that she is once again heavily drunk. It's actually another fun detail that on day 64, she informs us that she stores some alcohol near the creek, and here almost 2 weeks later, she is using the exact alcohol that she stole. Seeing as Delilah is no help when she's drunk, we turn off our radio and go to this new signal. Quickly finding the new signal's location behind some bushes is a backpack. The backpack has a key on it, and picking up the backpack reveals a motion sensor which starts beeping like crazy. Turning back our radio on and informing Delilah that we had just found a key in a backpack, Delilah makes a comment about how fastly we've returned to our lookout, although we obviously haven't. We tell Delilah this, and we both realize that someone else is intruding in Henry's station, and we run back to our lookout only to find no one there. We realize that the sensor that started beeping when we picked up the backpack was a signal for the intruder to make their way into our lookout. Trying to make it back inside our lookout, we find something taped to our window. The audio is cut to make it sound like we have every intention of burning down the campsite in the forest around us. It feels like pretty damning evidence of our plans that once again we never had. Someone is definitely toying with us, as if they really wanted us to be fired, they would have brought the tape in for proof already. Not realizing this yet, Henry informs Delilah of the tape, pretty nervous about what whoever is doing this' intentions are. The day ends, and day 79 starts with Henry replaying the tape for who knows how many times. Now realizing after a conversation with Delilah that the key we picked up from the backpack is the key to the locked door that we found in the cave way earlier in our playthrough, we make our way down to the cave and open up the gate. Taking just a few steps in, the gate slams shut behind us and we are stuck. Someone has locked us in. Trying to make a call to Delilah, we recognize that in the cave there is absolutely no signal with the radios. Our only chance of making it out of here is going deeper into the cave, hoping that there is some sort of other exit deeper in. Making our way through the cave, we find a hole that goes deeper down. Henry spots a shoe laying on the rock far out of reach. We call down to see if anyone's there, possibly injured that's fallen. We get no response. Henry makes it out of another exit, and finally being able to respond to Delilah, we report being trapped in the cave. While talking to Delilah, we find a small hideout with a bunch of comic books and seemingly school paperwork. We inform Delilah and she tells us this is almost certainly Ned Goodwin's son, Brian's hideout. Without having any other way out, we go deeper once again into the cave, maybe to find some evidence of whoever had just locked us in the cave and supposedly who had just been playing with us this entire time. Before we return though, Delilah tells us some new information about the two girls that had gone missing back near the beginning of the game. They had turned up. Both of the girls were alive. Nothing sinister had happened with them. At the bottom of the cave near the exit, Henry finds...
Ah, shit. Are you... Oh, God. You're Brian Goodwin.
Brian Goodwin's corpse. Brian had fallen supposedly during a climbing trip through the cave with his dad, and we can see his climbing gear laying next to him. I guess the climbing gear had failed him and he fell to his death, getting crushed by rubble that fell with him. The shoe that we found earlier was also Brian's, going off of how his corpse has only one shoe on it and both the shoes match. This is one of the most, if not the most emotional scene in the entire game, being accompanied by some very somber music. A nice detail that is included is that Henry cannot step on Brian's body. If we try to make it past him, a small animation plays as we step around the corpse, being very respectful of the dead boy. Now making our way past Brian and out of the cave for the final time, we tell Delilah about what we had found. Delilah is sent into shock. This marks the end of the conspiracy plotline, as now an actual death is involved, and things have gotten a lot more serious. And with that, we start the final day of the game. The forest fire had been getting worse throughout the entirety of the game and now has become uncontrollable. Both Henry and Julia, as well as every other lookout station in the campsite area, has been forced to evacuate. Henry packs up all of his stuff, but before we make our way to get evacuated...
Well, there's something for you to do. Holy shit.
Holy crap. Yeah, oh my God.
The wave receiver picks up one last signal. We told Delilah that we are going to find out whatever this signal has picked up before we leave. I think that Henry is so interested still in this part of the plot because it's the easiest thing to keep his mind busy instead of thinking about how he is now having to return home without his wife Julia being there. He doesn't have to think about her when he's thinking about all of this. And Henry, it seems, has tried to take this job as an opportunity to also distance himself from the thought of Julia. Don't get me wrong, he still was dedicated to Julia when he first got to the forest. I mean, he had picture frames set up and he would still wear his wedding ring. He still loves Julia. Now that she had been taken back to live with her family or had been put in the family home, away from Henry for the most part, the thought of her and the thought of living without her almost pains Henry. And with one of the very prevalent options of the story being for Henry to completely ignore Delilah's questioning about relationships that he might have had, there is definitely a side of Henry that almost wants to forget Julia. In the end sequence of the game, we have a conversation with Delilah about what we plan to do when we get home now that we've been evacuated. One of our options is to ask Delilah to come to Boulder with us. Henry has obviously had some sort of falling for Delilah, and is trying to build an actual relationship out of what he and Delilah had formed out in the forest. And I think by Delilah's response of kindly saying no and agreeing to maybe meet up in the future, shows that Delilah doesn't want a relationship with Henry as much as Henry wants one with her. She is much less desperate to have the distraction from her real life. She even calls out that Henry should try and visit Julia more often and be with her during these times. Henry begrudgingly agrees, realizing that Delilah is right and that moving on from Julia when she is still very alive is a little wrong of him. But Delilah doesn't have the same problem, as she's ready to move on, and the only real concern of hers is that she might not be able to work at a fire tower for a long while after this. The wave receiver brings us to one last tape. Our name is spray painted on the cliffside next to it, with a rope leading up to the top of the cliff. Listening to the tape, we realize that it is Ned Goodwin who is speaking. Listening to the entire tape, it's revealed that Ned Goodwin was actually the one that has been messing with us this entire time. He was the one that has been putting the tapes on our lookout, that had been listening in on our conversations, and everything else. Ned found himself in isolation in the forest instead of reporting his son's death to the authorities. He just couldn't bring himself to try and carry out his son's body from the cave, and Ned tells us that he didn't kill his son, which was also a big concern of his, that he would be reported as having killed his own son. Only proving this point when we informed Delilah of everything we heard on the tape, she immediately believes that Ned had killed Brian.
Because he killed Brian. Because he killed his fucking son.
Looking through the hideout where Ned had been staying, we find a bunch of callbacks to earlier in the game. Some teen magazines, a broken part of a boombox from the teen girls that we found at the beginning of the game, and a few other things from earlier in our playthrough. We even find notes from every day that we play through in the game from Ned's perspective, listening in on our conversations with Delilah. It's fun to look through these and see how different our conversations can be interpreted without actually seeing what we went through. Leaving with this newfound knowledge that there is actually no real conspiracy, Delilah tells us how she feels like she should be happy about it, but she's not. She wishes that there's actually something like a conspiracy going on in the forest and not just, well, the story of the Goodwins. Brian was a sweet kid, as Delilah tells us. He didn't deserve any of this. Neither did anyone. Even if Delilah thinks that Ned may or may not have deserved the same treatment as his son. Delilah also tells us that she can't stop contemplating the idea that she had the opportunity to send Brian home, since he technically wasn't allowed to be there. If she had done that, Brian would still be alive and with us today. That tussles with Delilah, as she finds it hard to deal with the idea that her decisions had led to someone's real death. Being informed that the evacuation helicopters had arrived, we can either plead for Delilah to stay and wait for us, or invite her to go on and we'll catch up later for the next evacuation flight. If we ask Delilah to stay, she promises to do so. Making it to Delilah's lookout tower where the evacuation pilots land, it feels super surreal to visit the place where Delilah has been this entire time. Her lookout is actually the cover of the game when you first load in, just a nice detail that the developers added. Actually going into Delilah's tower, we realize that Delilah isn't actually here. She did leave after all, even after promising to wait for us. She tells us that she's super sorry, but just couldn't bear another second in that smoke. I mean, it is pretty unbearable. Without anyone here, we look through Delilah's tower and spot the drawing that she made of us from the way beginning days of the game. Her drawing is actually quite similar to us, but obviously with some imperfections. Finally, the helicopter arrives to pick us up, as we are the last lookout tower worker left. Getting help getting into the helicopter, we look back at Delilah's tower one last time, and the game moves on to the credits. The photos that we had taken throughout the game display alongside the names in the credits. And if you didn't take any photos throughout the game, some generic ones that the dev team placed in will play instead. At the end of the display of photos that we took is the accidental selfie that Henry took when he first found the camera. After this, we see the dinosaur that we found in Brian's lookout overseeing the Firewatch tower that we inhabited throughout the entire game. We see a photo of Ned Goodwin, and a selfie of Brian, and one more of the two. And then, the game ends. Now, when it comes to critiquing and analyzing Firewatch, it's a lot more complex and difficult to do so solely because the game is so narratively driven by the choices that the player makes. What Henry does and how Henry acts throughout the game, mostly in relation to Delilah, is almost completely in the player's hands, even when given only a few options of dialogue. There are so many different ways and angles that I can go in to analyze the story, but I think I'm going to focus on Henry's story in relation to Julia and Delilah throughout the game. Now, I went over basically the entire prologue of the game, where we are introduced to Henry and Julia's relationship, because 1, it's one of the best prologues in gaming in my opinion, and 2, the story of Henry and Julia is super important for the player to know and watch as Henry grows as a person throughout Firewatch. Obviously, most of the people playing the game don't have any relation to anyone super close to them with dementia, especially at such a young age like with Henry and Julia. So for a large chunk of the player base, Julia won't be on the players' minds other than when she is called out specifically. This game offers so many options and so many choices for us as a player to make. This makes it exceptionally difficult to critique and give an actual narrative analysis of the game, since my playthrough can and most likely will be much different from yours. There's no real pinpointing of character growth or development that everyone went through. No matter how likely it is that some people made a certain decision, someone will always have made the other decision. This is just another example of why this game is so meaningful. With so many options of how to explore the world of Firewatch, basically each playthrough for a while can be completely different in terms of how Henry and Delilah and Julia interact. Something I found pretty interesting with the story though was how it retained a very playful and almost inviting style almost all the way up until the end. The game starts with a semi-lighthearted way of Henry finding a way to get away from his emotions and ties with Julia. The first few days of the game are purely just enjoyable adventures in the forest to get us as the player intrigued. For someone who has never played the game before or even seen anything on it, these first 2 days would be exactly how you'd expect the whole game to be played. And then we have that dream about our conversation with Julia, showing that even though us as the player haven't thought about Julia much since the prologue, Henry, as little as he does talk about Julia in this game, is still obviously dealing with the emotional damage he has surrounding her. Dreams aren't meaningless, and this one certainly isn't either. But even after that interjection with Julia, the game still remains lighthearted. We get to learn more about Delilah, and Delilah learns more about us. We're adventuring through the forest, and overall just having fun dealing with teenage campers who shouldn't be in the forest. This is, once again, until we come across the second campsite of the teenagers from the first day. Now in hindsight, we know that this is Ned Goodwin's doing, and that he is the one who wrote the note for us. But in the moment, the most probable culprit for this damage would either be the girls themselves or some type of animal attack like a bear. And moving on from that interaction, we're prone a bit more by Delilah about Julia, most likely bringing her back into the minds of the players as well as Henry. And then we get the first night when we see the real forest fire, and the one that eventually gets us evacuated out of the lookout. Now, in this section of the game, with Delilah being quite drunk, the developers could have most definitely dug deeper into the relationship side of Henry and Delilah if that was what they wanted to take the story. But they definitely took a different route, as after that night with a nice conversation with Delilah about a possible relationship between the two, is the first day that we actually discover the whole conspiracy section of the game. With Henry discovering the clipboard with his and Delilah's conversations written down on it, as well as the radio, and getting hit over the head by an unknown figure, who we now know is Ned. At this point in the game, the whole prologue with Julia and the relationship between Delilah and Henry takes a backseat as the conspiracy plot takes over. For me as a player, I was barely even thinking about Julia and Henry and the prologue at all after the prologue actually happened. In this conspiracy section of the plot, completely disregarding the prologue and Delilah and Henry's relationship put it out of my mind even more. Now, in retrospect, Ned was actually quite the mastermind when it came to basically everything regarding this section of the story, as he was listening in on our conversations between Delilah and Henry the entire time. He already knew that there were teenagers that had been messing around in the forest and Henry had not gotten off on the right foot with, so he used this opportunity to go back to Henry's lookout and take food as well as the sheets. We know that he took these things so he could stock up for the winter, as he was living in a not so well kept bunker out in the woods. He also made it look as if the teenagers were trashing his place, so he threw the typewriter out of the window. And because he was listening in on Delilah and Henry's conversations, he heard that Delilah was planning on reporting this break-in to Henry's lookout to the authorities, which Ned did not like, so he took it upon himself to cut the phone lines. He was hoping that this would delay Delilah's ability to report the case to the authorities and that she would maybe just completely forget to report it in the first place, which ended up actually happening. Delilah just completely forgot as the conspiracy plot continued to thicken. And one of my favorite parts about this section of the story is that at the end of the game when we find Ned's bunker and find all of his notes about each day, the day that we discussed with Delilah the possibility of a conspiracy out in the forest was actually quite funny to Ned, and it led him to lean into the whole idea of a conspiracy, which kept him playing with Henry and Delilah. Now, as basically any player of Firewatch in their first playthrough would question, the whole Wapiti station sequence felt insane when I first entered it. This felt like way too much, and I was getting super excited over the idea of a much larger-than-life conspiracy that had to do with Henry and Delilah. But as it turns out, Wapiti Station was not used directly by Ned, at least when it comes to all the technology surrounding it. Ned used Wapiti Station, once again, as a way to feed into Henry and Delilah's whole conspiracy thought process. He planted the binder of information about the two and placed the wave receiver on top of the binder under a bunch of papers so that Henry would find it, and assume, like I and a bunch of other players would have, that there's a much larger force at play here, which in hindsight there most obviously was not. The only way that this could have worked out for Ned is because of the forest fire and the original inhabitants of Wapiti Station, which have been evacuated already. So the documents Ned placed would have stayed where he placed them until Henry eventually found them. One of the biggest turnarounds for me was that Ned actually didn't want for Henry to find Brian's body and report it. Looking through his notes, that was a complete accident. I don't get how, because he literally left the keys to the cave on the backpack that he left as a distraction for Henry to get out of his station. Though I guess he was in such a rush that he might have just forgotten to take the keys off. And as Henry heads into the cave, Ned locks the doors behind Henry, which once again, why would he do this if he didn't want Henry to find Brian's body? I guess he thinks Henry might not have been able to escape and just dies down there with Brian's body, but that obviously didn't work out as he planned. Ned, as the technologist that we have found him to be, places another tape for Henry to find and moves out of the bunker that he left for Henry to also discover, as the forest fire has spread so much that it is no longer safe for Ned to stay there. But he did want for Henry to know the truth as everything was starting to wrap up. Ned didn't have any super ill intentions when it came to Henry and Delilah. He just wanted to mess with them, it seems, as living in a forest definitely could get quite boring after a while. It could also be perceived that Ned is telling his side of the story to Henry because as he has listened to a ton of the conversations that involved Henry, he's basically learned how Henry acts as a person, and that Henry might be more sympathetic for Ned and wouldn't report him to the police as a murderer of his son, which Delilah almost immediately assumes he did. It isn't actually told if Ned killed his son or not, and I honestly can't even decide for myself if he did or not. I mean, he seems so genuine in the tape that he left for Henry, but that could also just be him trying to garner sympathy points. A lot of people critique Firewatch for its ending, which is super understandable looking at it from a first playthrough perspective. The relationship built between Henry and Delilah, which is one of the most important parts of the entire game, basically adds up to nothing as they don't ever meet up after leaving the forest, and probably don't even keep contact. And Henry doesn't even get to meet Delilah at all, even if he asks her to stay and wait for him to get to her lookout. The whole government conspiracy plotline turns out to be just an old rugged dad who wants to mess with some lookout rangers. Personally, I like the ending a lot. It's much more real and almost brings us as a player to a standstill, realizing that this game is not just a fun exploration of the forest while dealing with some creepy mysteries. This ending takes us as a player back to reality, and the reality is that this boy and his father, like many hikers and campers, had an insanely unfortunate accident while exploring. But for a lot of people, this ending feels still lackluster. And as a lot of critics have said about the game, the choices that we've made for however many hours it took you to complete the game basically attest to nothing when it comes to how the game ends. What they mean by this is that the endings that you're able to get in Firewatch aren't represented by the choices that you made throughout the game. Every single dialogue choice that you made between you and Delilah doesn't make a difference, as Delilah still always leaves before we get the chance to meet her. This just isn't enough for a lot of players, which is again completely understandable. There isn't much I can say when it comes to defending how these points are brought up, but I would say that our choices in the game aren't as inconsequential as people might make them out to be. There's so many meticulous little details throughout the game that wouldn't have happened if you made different choices with how you interacted with the game and Delilah. And those little details are more than enough to satisfy me. No, it isn't arguable that for almost all players, the build-up with every single red herring throughout the game leading to basically nothing isn't a little bit disappointing for everyone. Though as a lot of the defenders of the game's ending would say, Henry and Delilah are invited to play this whole conspiracy plotline in and of itself. It wasn't even planned by Ned for them to think it was a conspiracy. They brought this upon themselves, and Ned just fed the fire once he found out that was their original thought process. Like, that's the whole point that Henry was out here, was to distract himself from Julia. And Delilah, having done this for so many years, has basically just lost herself in the job. These two characters have found their own ways, give it with some help, to distract themselves from their own lives. And that story is a lot more deep and meaningful than whatever the game has seemed to build up throughout, well, the entire game. Every red herring in the game is placed there by the developers as a way to distract Henry from his own life, and why he decided to come out here in the first place. He wanted to get away from his life. He wanted to get away from Julia, and all of these distractions were perfect examples of ways that he could get out of thinking about Julia and his life back in Boulder. And with all of these red herrings leading to basically nothing, with the conspiracy not being government driven, with the rejection by Delilah, and not even getting to meet her, this is supposed to be the big wrap-up and climax to the main plot of this game that basically every player forgot about. We were all, just like Henry, distracted from what mattered most, and that led most players to be disappointed with not getting the answers to the red herrings that they wanted. The main story is much less interesting to most players, similarly to how Henry wanted to distract himself from it. I'm not saying that a lot of these players that are saying the ending is anticlimactic just didn't get the ending, because that's just not true. The ending was made purposely by the developers to be this more realistic reveal, which could be a critique, and could just be another point made about the game. It was risky for the developers to purposefully mislead the players' expectations as to what the ending would be, and for most of the fanbase it didn't work out that well. But for those who understood the ending, possibly in their own way that the developers didn't even necessarily intend for, the ending stuck out as quite enjoyable actually. Now in today's world, with Firewatch getting more recognition due to it getting a bunch of videos on TikTok made about it and people finding out about the game for the first time, we'll most likely see a bigger wave of these critiques when it comes to the game's ending, and sooner than later, the game will most likely be forgotten by most people that have played it due to the sun rise 7 years after the game's release. The ending most definitely didn't work out when it comes to the game's longevity and the gaming space and staying topical. But for those who thoroughly enjoyed the game and its ending, it will forever stay in their minds as one of gaming's best stories and one of my favorite games that I've ever gotten the chance to play. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video. Bye bye!